May 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing like a house of cards. Smoke still drifted from the ruins of Bremen as the last German units staggered west, away from the Soviets, toward the British lines. They weren't fighting anymore. Their rifles hung useless at their sides, boots caked in mud, eyes hollow from nights without sleep. At dawn, a column of about 300 men approached a country road near Lübeck. A white sheet fluttered at the end of a broken rifle, their only flag now. Behind them limped officers without insignia, engineers without tools, boys who should have been in school. "We surrender," one shouted, his voice cracking in the mist. The British soldiers on the ridge had seen it all before. They'd spent weeks processing German POWs, herding them into barbed wire pens until trucks arrived. But this group felt different, too quiet, too desperate. When the lead sergeant ordered them to stop, not one of them looked up. "Lay down your weapons," the British officer said. His voice echoed over the fields. The Germans obeyed. Rifles dropped, helmets clattered, bayonets gleamed for a last time in the pale morning sun. By midday, the prisoners sat in rows beside a hedgerow. They were searched, counted, and given water. One of them, a former tank commander named Hans Keller, stared blankly at the grass. "It's over," he muttered to no one. "We surrendered yesterday, and still, we wake up." A young British corporal overheard him. "You surrendered yesterday?" he asked, puzzled. Hans nodded slowly. "Yes, but they said it wasn't official. The shooting didn't stop until last night. Some men didn't make it." His voice trembled, the words heavy with exhaustion. That night, rain swept across the camp. The British guards huddled in their tents, while the Germans lay in the mud. Too tired to speak, rumors spread. That the guards were angry about a British patrol ambushed nearby, that orders had changed, that the prisoners would be moved before sunrise. At dawn, the bugle sounded. Trucks rumbled into the field, headlights cutting through fog. The guards formed a line, weapons slung, eyes cold. Hans Keller lifted his head. Something felt wrong. He turned to the man beside him, a medic with trembling hands. "Maybe today they'll take us home," the medic whispered. Hans gave a faint, bitter smile. "Home? No, my friend. We surrendered yesterday. Today, we'll see what that truly means." The engines idled, boots splashed through puddles. Orders were shouted, and as the first rays of light crept over the field, the German POWs realized the war wasn't done with them yet. The first light of morning came pale and cold, like a ghost creeping across the misty fields. The trucks stood in silence now, lined up behind the British positions. Steam rose from their engines, and the smell of diesel mixed with the wet earth. The air felt thick, not with battle anymore, but with something heavier: expectation. Fear. A whistle blew. The guards stepped forward in formation, boots sinking into the mud. "On your feet!" a British sergeant barked. The German POWs stirred, some struggling to rise, others too weak to move without help. The war had stripped them of everything: their pride, their command, their certainty of what came next. Captain Douglas Wright, the officer in charge, walked slowly down the line. His face was hard, but his eyes betrayed the fatigue of a man who had seen too much killing. The day before, a British patrol had been ambushed a few miles away. 7 men dead, their bodies found in a barn. The attackers had worn German uniforms. Nobody knew if these prisoners were part of that ambush, but the anger hung in the air like gunpowder. Wright stopped in front of Hans Keller. "You were tank crew?" he asked, flipping through a soggy notebook. Hans nodded. "Panzer Commandant, 12th Division." His English was rough but clear. "We laid down arms. We did not fight yesterday." The captain studied him for a long moment. "And yet my men are dead because some of yours didn't get the message." Hans opened his mouth to speak, but saw the captain's jaw tighten. There was nothing to say. The captain turned to his sergeant. "Move them to the field behind the hedgerow. Separate the officers." The POWs were marched away, mud splashing up their torn trousers. Some whispered prayers. Others simply stared at the ground. The British soldiers avoided their eyes. When they reached the backfield, the prisoners were ordered to sit. No breakfast, no water. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, drying the mud into crusts around their boots. Then, as the church bell from a nearby village rang noon, The captain returned. He carried a slip of paper, an order from brigade command. It was brief, written in cold official language. Ensure complete disarmament of surrendered personnel. Prevent reorganization. Use discretion as necessary. Wright folded the note, exhaled slowly, and looked at the rows of prisoners. The meaning was clear enough. Discretion. That single word had cost lives before. He turned to his men. Strip them of belts and boots. No weapons, no insignia, no pride. As the British soldiers moved down the line, cutting away belts and empty holsters, a murmur rippled through the prisoners. One man protested. A young lieutenant who still wore his Iron Cross. A guard ripped it from his chest and threw it into the mud. Hans clenched his fist but said nothing. He watched as the symbol sank into the wet soil, vanishing beneath the boot prints of a war that refused to end. The captain looked on, silent. He knew this wasn't justice. It was exhaustion disguised as order. But the next command, the one that came an hour later, would go far beyond humiliation. It would be something no one present would ever forget. By mid-afternoon, the clouds rolled in again, a gray ceiling pressing down on the camp. The hedgerow field had turned quiet except for the restless rustle of uniforms and the metallic click of rifles being checked. The British guards waited. They had been told new instructions were on the way from brigade headquarters. No one spoke above a whisper. Captain Wright stood under a makeshift canopy, dripping rainwater from his cap. His radio crackled for a moment, then fell silent. Finally, a messenger jeep bounced through the gate, spraying mud. The driver handed him an envelope sealed with the brigade crest. Inside was a short typed sheet, the ink already smudging from the damp. All captured personnel to be relocated immediately. Enemy property to be confiscated. Confirm compliance by 1800 hours. Delays not tolerated. Relocated. Wright frowned at the word. Everyone knew it meant a forced march. No trucks, no rest, just movement until the prisoners were someone else's problem. After days without food or shelter, many wouldn't survive the trip. Still, orders were orders. He folded the paper and stepped into the rain. "Sergeant," he called, "form them up full column." The prisoners were dragged to their feet again, belts gone, boots hanging loose. Some limped barefoot through the wet grass. One guard shouted at them to hurry. Another muttered under his breath, "Haven't they suffered enough?" Hans Keller walked in the front row. His thoughts drifted between relief and dread. A relocation meant they weren't being shot, but it also meant uncertainty, perhaps a march into nowhere. The medic beside him whispered, "Maybe they'll feed us this time." Hans didn't answer. He had learned not to believe in maybes. The column began to move. Mud sucked at their feet. The rain made their gray uniforms almost indistinguishable from the earth. British trucks rolled slowly behind them, engines growling like watchful beasts. Every few hundred meters, a guard shouted for the column to stop, count, and continue. They passed a small village whose residents stood at doorways, staring silently. A few British soldiers tossed bread crusts from their rations. Most looked away. The war was over, but forgiveness was still months away. By the time the sun slipped behind the woods, they reached an open meadow bordered by trees. The captain signaled for the march to halt. "We bivouac here," he said. "They'll be collected in the morning." But the guards exchanged uneasy looks. The next morning, hadn't that been the phrase used before? Every new morning brought another command, another punishment. Hans sank to the ground, water pooling around him. His stomach ached with emptiness. Across the field, a British corporal lit a cigarette, watching the prisoners settle like ghosts. "You think they deserve any better?" one soldier asked him. The corporal exhaled smoke. "I don't know what anyone deserves anymore." Lightning flashed far off over the river. The captain closed his eyes. He wanted to believe that this was the end of it, that tomorrow would bring trucks, paperwork, maybe even relief. But the night had other plans, and when morning came again, it would deliver the shock none of them expected. Dawn crept slowly across the meadow, staining the fog pale gold. The rain had stopped, but the cold remained sharp enough to bite through the prisoners' thin uniforms. They stirred from shallow sleep, some sitting upright, others still curled in the mud. No one spoke. The silence was the kind that followed too much waiting. A whistle blew from the British side. The guards were already awake, helmets glinting faintly under the weak light. Orders were murmured between them, quick and uncertain. Something was different. The tension that had hung in the air the day before was back. Heavier, darker. Captain Wright emerged from his tent, his expression unreadable. He'd spent most of the night awake, pacing under the dripping trees, thinking about the message that had come just before midnight. A second telegram from Brigade Command. It was short, almost cruel in its brevity. No transport available. Prevent movement of prisoners towards Soviet lines. Hold position. Take necessary measures. Wright had stared at those last three words for hours. Take necessary measures. He knew what they could mean. The Soviets were closing in from the east, and neither side wanted thousands of POWs wandering into no man's land. If they tried to move, chaos could erupt. If they stayed, they risked being overrun. Either way, someone would pay. Now as he walked through the damp grass toward the huddled prisoners, the British guards avoided his eyes. "On your feet," he ordered quietly. "All of you." Hans Keller rose slowly, his muscles stiff. Around him, men muttered prayers in broken whispers. One clutched a rosary made from wire. Another held a photograph, the edges blurred from rain. They had surrendered to live, but now it seemed that surrender had only delayed death. The guards began separating the prisoners into groups of 20. Each group was lined up facing the open field. Hans felt his chest tighten. He turned to the medic beside him. "What is this?" he whispered. The medic swallowed hard. "I think they're choosing who stays." Captain Wright stopped in front of the first group. He read from a list, names scribbled on a wet sheet of paper. Some were officers, others random selections. Those called forward were marched a few paces ahead, under the watch of soldiers gripping their rifles. A murmur rippled through the ranks. "What's happening?" someone shouted in German. No answer came. Only the clatter of boots and the metallic click of safeties being released. Wright hesitated. His sergeant leaned closer. "Sir, these are orders?" The captain's jaw tightened. "Orders," he repeated, though his voice sounded hollow, like a man trying to convince himself. He raised his hand, and in that moment a cry broke from the line. One of the prisoners had collapsed, clutching his chest. The guards stepped back instinctively, and the captain lowered his arm. The sound of chaos spread. Coughing, shouting, pleading. Wright stared at the faces before him, at the terror and confusion, and something in him cracked. He turned to his sergeant again, voice low. "No executions. Not like this." The sergeant blinked. "Then what, sir?" "Detain them," Wright said finally. "Every last one. They'll live to see what command does next." Relief swept through the ranks. Quiet, trembling relief. But for Captain Wright, the damage was done. The men would live, yeah, but word of his hesitation would spread faster than mercy. And when headquarters learned he'd defied the order, the necessary measure, the real reckoning would begin. The next morning dawned clear for the first time in weeks. The sky stretched pale and empty above the field, as if nothing terrible had ever happened there. Dew clung to the grass. The smell of wet soil and smoke drifted through the camp. The prisoners were still alive, bruised, hungry, shivering, but alive. To them, survival felt almost like betrayal. Captain Wright stood at the edge of the field, watching them in silence. He hadn't slept. His uniform was stiff with mud and sweat. Around him, the guards avoided eye contact, their respect for him twisted with doubt. They knew he had stopped an execution order, and though part of them was grateful, another part whispered that he'd defied command. The sergeant approached, a folded message in his hand. "It came an hour ago, sir. Brigade wants a full report. They're sending a replacement." Wright nodded slowly. A replacement. The word hung in the morning air. That meant he was finished. A soldier who had chosen conscience over obedience. He took the note, tucked it into his pocket, and looked once more at the prisoners. Hans Keller sat among them, his face hollow but calm. When he saw Wright approaching, he tried to stand but stumbled. The captain caught his arm before he fell. For a brief moment, the two men, enemies yesterday, survivors today, met each other's eyes, no salute, no hatred. Just two men crushed beneath the same endless war. You stopped it, Hans said quietly. His English had softened, almost grateful. I delayed it, Wright replied. That's all. Hans looked at the ground. Sometimes delay is mercy. The captain almost smiled, but his expression hardened again. There'll be trucks today, he said. You'll be sent to a holding camp near Hamburg. Food, shelter, maybe even letters home. Hans nodded. And you? Wright exhaled. I'll be answering questions. By noon, the trucks arrived. Gray, canvas-topped, engines coughing black smoke. The prisoners climbed aboard one by one. No one spoke, not even the guards. The war was ending, but it had left behind too many ghosts to count. When the last truck pulled away, Captain Wright remained in the empty field. Only boot prints and scraps of fabric marked where hundreds had waited for death. The sergeant approached quietly. Sir, was it worth it? Wright stared at the horizon. We spent 6 years learning how to kill, he said softly. Maybe it's time someone remembered how to stop. The sergeant said nothing. He simply saluted, turned, and walked away. The captain stayed until the sound of the engines faded completely. That evening, as he packed his belongings for the final time, Wright unfolded the report he was meant to send. Instead, he wrote a single sentence at the bottom. They surrendered yesterday, and today we learned what surrender truly means. He signed his name, folded the paper neatly, and left it on his desk outside. The sun dipped low over the English Channel, its reflection glinting like fire on the water. Somewhere beyond that light, the prisoners rode toward an uncertain peace. Somewhere behind it, the ghosts of a world gone mad faded quietly into history. The war had ended, but its memory, like the morning fog, refused to lift.